We've seen the latest chapter in the gun debate playing out at schools across the country today, but what about in the place where actual changes can come from, Capitol Hill? We saw a silent protest on Capitol Hill today that was particularly moving and pointed. Activists put 7,000 pair of shoes on the lawn in front of the Capitol, representing the children who have died from gun violence since the Sandy Hook massacre 5 years ago. As for what's happening inside the Capitol on guns, the answer is less than you might think, in large part because the Trump administration has backed off many of the proposals even the president was personally touting. The White House is only formally backing these proposals: a commission to study school violence with a focus on training teachers to carry guns, also beefing up incentives for states to do better reporting into the background check system, and perhaps banning bump stocks, which the president thinks can be done through executive order, which may not be true. But those are pretty far gone from some of the ideas the president had been talking about, including raising the age for gun sales to 21, expanding background checks to include gun shows and online sales, banning and confiscating guns from red flag risks, people identified as potential risks to themselves or others. That was Trump's take the guns and worry about the due process later line. And again, banning bump stocks, which may take Congress to act, but the White House isn't asking Congress to do that. And those are just the ideas that Trump mentioned, to say nothing of other gun control ideas like banning semi-automatic weapons or high-capacity magazines, or even making background checks universal. So let's discuss the state of the gun debate in our politics. And for that, we introduce tonight's panel. We got a good one and a big one. Scott Levinson is here, the president and founder of the Advance Group. Welcome back. To his left, our long-lost soldier, Dominic Carter, political journalist and author, late of the Percoco corruption trial. More on that later. On the other side of the table, Joseph Pinion is a Republican strategist. And next to him, Vinny Blasio, who ran George Pataki's campaign for president and Joe Loda's campaign for New York mayor. And gentlemen, in the last month since we saw the massacre at Parkland, everybody's been saying we have the students now. The student voices are the one thing that we haven't had in the past in these debates. That's what's different. And yet, if we're still in maximum pressure mode, like we saw from the students again today, and the best we can get out of Congress are those proposals that are on the margins, what does that say about where our gun debate is right now? And Scott, I'll start with you.
It says that a movement isn't built in one day. One state-sanctioned walkout for 17 minutes does not build a mass movement and does not create change in a culture that's been victimized by this craziness for quite some time. It's great that you have kids involved, as it was when you had kids involved in the civil rights movement, but during the civil rights movement, when people got arrested, they did so to fill up the jails in Mississippi, not to get released in 2 hours and tweet about it. So in order to build a mass movement, you have to be able to escalate, you have to be able to disrupt, and you don't disrupt with everybody letting you walk out for 17 minutes.
Vinny, is there additional pressure on the NRA and Republicans facing the NRA right now? Or, I mean, we've seen Florida actually move for some gun control,
Right.
but is there any additional separation between Republicans and the NRA?
At this stage, I don't think so. I mean, the last thing speaking specifically of the House of Representatives, you need 24 seats right now. The last thing any Republican candidate in these tough districts, I mean, you could just look at the special election yesterday, the last thing you want is a primary on your right. And I think that has cooled off any momentum that we had to get some meaningful change.
Joe, even if there are Republican losses in the November midterms, does that change the Republican mindset when it comes to guns? Does that liberate the GOP from the NRA?
Well, look, I think that first and foremost, this kind of tethering to the NRA, I think, is really more political fodder than anything in reality. I think when you talk about the fact that even in this election we had in Pennsylvania, I have friends that literally on Friday were retweeting about the fact that the NRA is a terrorist organization, hopped in a zip car that night, went to Pennsylvania to campaign for a guy that had AR-15s in his commercials. So I think on some basic level, I think that there has to be on some deeper issue, some type of, again, on both sides of the issue, having the intellectual integrity to be able to have the conversation about the issue.
But you know as well as I do that there would be Republicans who would be willing to vote for some measures of gun control if it wasn't for the threat of the NRA financing a challenger.
No, I don't think that is why that people are afraid to come out on guns. I think the reality, what people drastically underestimate, is the fact that the NRA has power because there are people who actually like guns. It's not the other way around. And so, again, I think that there are plenty of Republicans that want actual things done on gun reform. There are people that want gun stacks banned, for anyone from Senator Roberts in Kansas all the way over to Senator Rubio in Florida. And yet you can't find Democrats to walk into their office with a bill to co-sponsor. So ultimately, again, there has to be responsibility taken on both sides.
You can't posture like that. I'm sorry.
not a posture.
I'm sorry. The fact is, Republicans nationally have
That-
been
that-
cozying up to the NRA for decades, and you can't deny
No,
the
no,
political.
I'm not-
the po- no, you did
No,
because
I'm not-
I
I'm
mean
not
you can't.
denying anything.
So let's not
That's
deny
not
the.
denying the political process.
So
Are there-
I mean,
are there
I'm sorry. Whenever you're done.
Are there political?
Whenever you're done.
Are there political bedfellows? Yes, absolutely.
But that
to
is
sit
the
here,
point.
but
That is the
but
point
to sit
that
here and
national
say,
Republicans have to stand up and say that there are certain things that are wrong. There has to be some moral imperatives. There has to be some core principles. And when you have mass attack weapons plaguing our country, day in, day out, year in, year out, everybody's got to stand up and say that ain't right.
Well, let me jump in, and I want to focus on the gun control or the gun safety side of the ledger, because Dominic, you know as well as I do that when it comes to guns, NRA supporters and gun rights supporters vote on that issue. It's a voting issue. It draws them to the ballot box, and it's a #1 issue. It's why they vote the way they vote. It's never been that way on the gun control side, at least not in mass. Is this the environment where that changes, or do we still not know yet?
We can only hope so. We can only hope so. That when it comes, we've seen abortion used as a litmus test. It needs to be the same thing as it relates to gun control. And that's why, bravo, to some people claim that these young people are being used as political pawns. I completely disagree with that assessment. This is democracy at play from the younger generation. And frankly, after we saw what happened in Connecticut, and I'm going to say it, my colleagues may not go as far, the NRA owns many politicians, period. And I'm not going to say that they own the president, but that's why we saw where the president went out there and talked about making things better more on the gun control side and immediately walked it back because nobody wants to take on the NRA and all their money.
Let's ask the question. Do people somehow intrinsically in this country have a right to an assault weapon? Is there somewhere that we think that the average citizen somehow deserves the right to have an assault
again,
weapon?
what-
But
so-
that's a question.
but
It's
here-
a
well, here's the
yes or no
question.
question.
Here's the
It's a
question.
yes or no
No,
question.
let's
So you
not
can't.
posture.
You
Let's not.
can't.
Don't.
No,
don't-
it's true.
No, don't posture
Truth.
that, because first and
You
foremost,
can't.
no. Let's be
You
let's
can't.
be let's be
Sorry.
let's be very
Answer
clear.
the question.
Let's be very
Let him
clear.
answer.
Right, you're sitting here saying you have to understand intrinsically that you're having two different conversations on behalf of a
question.
party that's trying to have one conversation.
question.
No, you're asking one question.
That is.
We're talking
Right
about
here.
the party. Yeah, but that's you personally sitting
It
here
is.
in this
Answer the
chair,
question.
and yet I
Straight
can turn
up.
around any other
Straight up
channel
and
right
answer
now.
the question.
What are you talking about? Straight up and answer the question.
Answer.
The question right now is not what you're talking about
That's
right
a
now.
shame.
The question what we're
It's a
talking
shame.
about. What is the shame?
That you can't say no. No one has that right.
What do you mean no one has that right?
His-
I'm sorry, I'm
his
not going to
question-
sit
his
here and
question was-
rewrite the Second Amendment with
His
you in
question
2
was,
seconds.
do people have a right to own an
I
assault weapon?
believe that we as a society should be able to sit down and come up with common sense gun reforms that also agree with us taking a look at the fact of whether or not people actually need to have those guns. I think that is a realistic conversation for us to have. The notion that somehow you have arrived with all of the high ground on morality to say yes or no across the board.
Yep.
No, I
think people stand up for what's right and wrong.
I think
And
that is
that's wrong.
that is a certain type of moral
Just
arrogance
called
that I
wrong.
won't
Okay.
entertain.
Just called wrong.
Vinny,
Yes.
you've been waiting to chime in.
Yeah, I may lose my Republican credentials for saying this, but I've said that yes, you should have the right to an assault weapon if you want to be a member of a police force or the military. I don't see what use it has in society today. But to your question,
Yeah, I have to say bravo to that as well.
Thank you.
so I'm a liberal Republican. But,
At least on this.
but the intensity, to the point, has always been on the pro-gun side, your right to own a gun. And all the surveys I've looked at outside of New York and even upstate New York, it's always, you see that intensity on, the pro-gun side. Maybe today what we've seen is the beginning, but I think as Scott said, it's not going to be built in a day. Maybe we see the beginning of the gun control side that will bring forth some just common sense solutions to this. I mean, when you think of Parkland, I was hopeful after Newtown. When you saw the ages of those kids, not that any age is appropriate.
We've seen so many of them.
But with Parkland, so many things could have been done to prevent this, and yet it wasn't. And I was encouraged when the president said, make me the bad guy. I'll do it. And then we kind of moved away from that.
We could honestly continue this debate for the entire show, but there are other topics that we want to get to, so we will move on. And up next, a conga line of corruption cases. Joe Prococo's trial just ended. We'll ask Dominic about that. The former Cuomo aide convicted on 3 counts. Now former Nassau County Executive Ed Mangano is in court for his corruption case, and more are on the way.